Hello, my name is Jeff Farbman from the Wallace Center at Winrock International. Welcome to the National Good Food Network webinar, A Look Back, A Path Forward, Lessons Learned from the Food Hub Vanguard, Grasshoppers Distribution. Grasshoppers in Louisville, Kentucky was an NGFN Food Hub Collaboration Study Hub committed to openness and sharing with peers and the wider community. We were not at all alone in our sadness when the hub closed its doors, but the commitment to openness remained. I believe you'll be inspired by the amazing work Grasshoppers was able to do in Louisville, and those currently running a hub or thinking about opening one, as well as funders, financiers, and investors, will learn from Grasshoppers' struggles and innovations. I'm going to give you a brief explanation of the Wallace Center, the National Good Food Network, and the NGFN Food Hub collaboration, and then introduce our first panelists. The Wallace Center, a business unit of Winrock International, is the host of the NGFN webinar series. The Wallace Center has been a leading organization in the movement for a more sustainable and equitable food system for over 30 years. Today, the center supports entrepreneurs and communities as they build a new 21st century food system that is healthier for people, the environment, and the economy. The center serves the growing community of civic, business, and philanthropic organizations involved in building a new good food system in the United States. In particular, we're focused on advancing regional, collaborative efforts around the country to move healthy, green, fair, affordable food beyond the direct marketing realm into larger scale wholesale channels. The National Good Food Network, or NGFN, is an initiative of the Wallace Center. It is structured as a network of networks, ensuring efficient flow of information and innovation from the boots-on-the-ground projects to the national level and back down to the grassroots level across the nation. The Wallace Center coordinates and supports the network. Our goals are to work with the growers to ensure that there's abundant supply of good food to meet the high consumer demand for the product, to collect and disseminate the best models, stories, methods, and outcomes, and to ensure that policymakers are informed about the wonderful successes our network and partners have had so that we can continue to increase support for regional healthy food. You can learn more about the great work of the National Good Food Network on our website, ngfn.org. So first up today is the team from University of Kentucky, Tim Woods and Lily Brislin. Dr. Tim Woods is a professor of agricultural economics and state extension specialist in the area of horticulture, agribusiness marketing, and management. He has devoted his time and energy to help facilitate the development of small ag-related businesses and cooperatives that have promising, innovative processes and/or products. He served as staff economist to the Kentucky Governor's Office of Ag Policy and Ag Development Board. His work includes farm entrepreneurship, business planning, cooperative development, consumer market research for microenterprises, and facilitating value-added enterprises for farmers and agriculture. He recently developed Market Ready, a nationally recognized best marketing practice education program for farmers selling to restaurants, grocery, and wholesale. Dr. Woods teaches agribusiness management and marketing horticultural products at the University of Kentucky. And Lily Brislin is the newly appointed director of the University of Kentucky's Food Connection, a new regional food system initiative focused on interdisciplinary and innovative instruction, high-impact service and outreach, and cutting-edge research on foods and food systems. She is also a PhD candidate in rural sociology at the University of Kentucky, and her dissertation looks at the impact of 3 case study food hubs in the southeastern U.S. on participating mid-sized farms. She received her MS in agriculture from the University of Kentucky and her BA from Beloit College.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lillian Brislin, and thank you so much for the introduction there, Jeff. And we're going to share, Dr. Woods and myself are sharing a report that we just released based on a study looking at the history of grasshoppers distribution. So we're going to cover a lot of ground here today, and so looking forward to sharing it with you. Okay, here we go. So for those of you that aren't familiar or perhaps want to catch up on the history of Grasshoppers, Grasshoppers was a food hub built in Louisville, Kentucky in the wake of the tobacco buyout program, which was the transition away from tobacco production and the quota system in our state, and a major point of transition for agriculture. And for more information on that, just read our report. But just to know that that was the context. And to start off, we should say that Grasshoppers Distribution as an enterprise was a true pioneer in seeking how to best promote and provide regionally produced foods in Kentucky. They opened their doors just before the onset of the Great Recession, as we call it, and worked to adapt to new challenges and opportunities as public interest in local food expanded, at the same time that new and existing food businesses sought to take advantage of the same growing but nascent market opportunity. So a lot of new market entrants as Grasshoppers was trying to figure out what they were going to do. And as such, Grasshoppers forged new paths in discovering the unique opportunities and challenges to regional food system development in Kentucky. They operated for almost 7 years and grew to nearly $1 billion in annual sales over the course of their lifetime, and shut their doors in December of 2013. And here we go. Oh, sorry, guys. Great. So about this study. So when the doors shut, a lot of people were saddened and confused, or it certainly wanted to know what happened. So along with the National Good Food Network and Hudson Wave and a bunch of interested partners, a team formed at the University of Kentucky to kind of do a check-in to see lessons learned and the lasting legacy. So this is a truly multidisciplinary mixed methods approach. And our research questions really to identify the management, financial, marketing, and agency or partnership patterns that could have contributed to the eventual failure of Grasshoppers, as well as looking at, what are the takeaways here? How is Kentucky's food system changed, and what we can say largely better off and immensely better off because of Grasshoppers' efforts and all of the support that went into that initiative. And also our goal was to develop some recommendations and best practices for future initiatives based on what we learned from Grasshoppers' story, which is part of what we're doing here today. Okay, so the project was a collaboration between myself as a rural sociologist and a team of agricultural economists, Dr. Lee Meyer, Dr. Tim Woods, who's with us today, and Nathan Rout, who works for the Kentucky Center for Agricultural and Rural Development. And I'll let Tim talk about the financial analysis component.
Yeah, we'll pick up the more details on the financial analysis, but essentially we were very generously provided with fairly detailed annual, quarterly financial data because there were so many interested parties and invested parties, grant applications, other kinds of financial data that was provided throughout the entirety of both the planning process, the implementation of Grasshoppers, gave us a wealth of information to be able to go back and do sort of an ex post evaluation. And so we spent a lot of time looking at this financial data, particularly looking at some of the key financial ratios, looking at liquidity, solvency, profitability, etc. And a lot of it as well was supplemented then by a lot of what Lily and Lee Meyer were largely involved with the qualitative analysis, which involved, good grief, Lily, dozens and dozens of interviews with folks from all different quarters and connections with Grasshoppers.
Great, yeah. So on the qualitative analysis, we really tried, recognizing that certainly the books have a lot to tell us about the story of an enterprise, but there's also a very human component to this work, as I'm sure you all know. So we did a series of focus groups with former producers and customers. So a focus group with farmers who supplied Grasshoppers, a focus group with restaurant and wholesale, former restaurant and wholesale customers, and then a focus group with former CSA or subscription service, so individual household members, to get a perspective of what was working, what was your experience of Grasshoppers, what did you learn, what were the impacts. And then we also did a series of in-depth interviews with former staff, former board members and investors, some former funders, and also a few additional in-depth interviews with farmers who participated. And then in addition, we gathered former business applications, business plans, and grant applications to get piecing together the history of a 7-year enterprise with as many people as involved in it was a really unique and wonderful challenge. And really helpful in that was former business plans and grant applications that gave us a sense of how the mission and the enterprise developed over time, which is what we're going to talk about. Okay. Oh, here we go. So as we mentioned, oh my gosh, guys, I'll get this. There we go. Grasshoppers had a warehouse located in West Louisville, which has been identified as having unique challenges to food access and health disparities. Over the course of the enterprise, they engaged in a number of different business models, which we'll walk through on the next slide, including wholesale restaurant sales, a community-supported agriculture-like project, some a la carte online grocery sales, and then in the end, efforts at value-added products and institutional sales. They worked with over 70 different producers, and as part of their efforts also did a lot of work around producer development and education and consumer education. And then this is the really detailed history that we'll get into. And I'm going to talk through the top part of the slide, and Tim's going to talk through the bottom. So don't worry, we're going to spend a lot of time here. So the top half of this timeline shows us changes in the business enterprise over its 7 or so years of organization. So as you'll see, there were 5 different general managers, which is, I think they had different titles, but that's the term we're using in the course of the enterprise. And the doors opened in 2007 after they received a value-added producer grant, which Tim can talk about. That first general manager and the initial business plan was focused on food access and wholesale sales, but because there was inadequate capacity on the producer side, there weren't as many wholesale-ready producers as they'd anticipated, and some unanticipated bottlenecks working with the restaurant customers. Within a year, it was decided to change the business model to a CSA-like subscription service, in that shares were sold. It was operated exactly like a CSA. Shares were sold at the beginning of the year, and then boxes were delivered to drop sites to customers. And the initial break-even for that model was 500 subscribers, and it grew over the course of the next few years to 2,000, which again we'll talk about more. And the switch to the CSA model was informed by the hope that a higher margin allowed by a CSA model of 40% versus 20% would solve, some of the cash flow issues that resulted, and make it more viable. The second general manager had come in with the agreement of working for a year, left after that year, and a third general manager was brought in. Within a year, continued cash flow issues resulted in bringing in an outside consultant and working with KCARD, so the Kentucky Center for Agriculture and Rural Development, to look at how Grasshoppers could revitalize their business model to achieve viability, and at that point there was a general recommendation to shut down this business. Because of the passion and because of the buy-in and the real just commitment of the entire community to have something like Grasshoppers available for our mid-sized producers and for our local food system, that consultant came on as the general manager and really tried to turn that ship around. So with that, an online marketplace was launched, is what I referred to earlier as the a la carte service. So in addition to the CSA-style subscriptions, a la carte or kind of pay-as-you-go, choose what you like service was offered, where customers could go online and choose. And there was also an expansion of the product offerings to include more proteins, meats, dairies, cheeses, eggs, and additional items. And at that same time, as part of a recapitalization, which Tim will talk about, an investor board was formed. So for the first 3.5 or so years, Grasshoppers was started and run by, and I should have said this earlier, 4 farmers who came together through a process facilitated by a local nonprofit organization, and who had various experiences with the food system and who identified a real need for a kind of one-stop shop to local foods and an opportunity for farmers transitioning out of tobacco into new high-value markets to have a reliable outlet for their product. They put personal money in, they put a ton of sweat equity in, but by the end of 2010 and in early 2011 it was recognized that there was going to need to be a new capitalization, which is where the investor board came in. And details about that transition, again, are in the report. There was a tremendous effort to try to expand the sales of Grasshoppers, grow the CSA, and then shares sales up to 2,000 subscribers to reach viability. But continued those projections just weren't met. In 2012, there was an attempt to expand Grasshoppers' offerings again into value-added production, so the idea of taking more of the product from farmers, creating more high-value opportunities both for the farmer and for grasshoppers, and we'll talk about that. Excuse me. And then in 2013, the fourth general manager exited after a great amount of work, and a fifth general manager came on. There were attempts to move to more institutional sales, but because there was a dependence on those subscription and a la carte sales, they weren't able to move fully into institutional and value-added. And ultimately, the financial situation led to the doors closing in 2013, which is a very quick overview of a very long and complicated history, which we'll continue to delve into. But then I'll let Tim talk through the financial history of that.
Thanks, Lily. So I'm not going to go here box by box, but just wanted to maybe lay this out here so that you can appreciate. We're going to show you the sales graphic here in chronology in just a moment, but to show that the entity itself, which started very humbly with 4 producers that had a goal to try to cooperate in some way to pursue what they viewed as growing opportunities in the local market demand, local food market demand there in the general Louisville area. And they were successful in getting a value-added producer grant. That's been a great program nationally, and it fit in really well with what they were trying to do as well. And as that program was starting to become a larger and larger concept involving potentially more producers, you can see other entities coming alongside Grasshoppers in providing not only financial support, as is laid out here, but a lot of agency support, technical support. Our Co-op Development Center, which is the K-Card group, as Lily had mentioned, provided a lot of ongoing technical support here. But more and more investment that is coming in to try to capitalize and support the Grasshoppers effort. But one of the things, we're going to pick this up here a little bit later on, that is kind of it just happens when you get more and more people investing in an entity, as you have more and more somewhat diverse interests and directions in terms of where the entity is going to go. And it did indeed lead to some tensions and some conflicts, and the growers kind of getting pushed back a little bit to the back burner. Lots of challenges. And you see there are a lot of outside loans that we're going to come back and look at the debt challenges that Grasshoppers faced there over time. But a lot of these new monies that were coming in, partly were coming alongside new visions, new direction, new sort of strategic orientation that came about either as a result of a new general manager or the growers saying they wanted to go in a new direction, or the Ag Development Board with the Governor's Office having some of their goals and objectives there as well. Things started to get really complicated financially there, and we'll pick that up. But maybe, Lily, you can go ahead on to the next graphic there and just sort of show this projected and actual sales figure here came out of a presentation that was done by one of the general managers to the Governor's Office of Ag Policy. They were trying to do some forward projection of where they thought Grasshoppers could go. And you can see the steady growth in sales, and fairly modest, under $500,000 there for the first couple of years, and growing up to where it finally wound up closing its doors there in 2013, right around $1 million in sales. But they had really ambitious goals, and part of that was driven by a recognized need for achieving scale and capturing scale economies that they were just really struggling to try to capture. And we'll touch a little bit more on that when we get to some of the financial analysis. Lily, anything you want to say about this graphic?
Nope, I think you did it well. Okay, so the next section is going to draw primarily from the qualitative section of the research. And I'd just like to again emphasize the incredible impact that the initiative of Grasshoppers had on our agricultural sector by pulling this quote from one of the former farmer suppliers. When Grasshoppers was closing down, it seemed like there were a lot of farmers kind of where we were, developing their business and who really wanted to get into moving a larger volume of product. Grasshoppers was a stepping stone from that. And if we take one thing from this story, it's that these efforts, even though Grasshoppers has closed its doors, its impact is long-lasting and continues to this day, and especially on the end of producer development. But when we look at the lessons learned, and I'll outline, I think I have 4 here. One of the first ones is the value of expertise and sufficient infrastructure, and maybe I'd add capital, in getting started. So when Grasshoppers opened its doors, they had the value-added producer grant, the modest farmer investments, and they had been banking on a loan from our governor's office, or our agricultural development board. When the agricultural development board loan didn't come through, they decided to move forward anyway. Again, speaking to that kind of passionate commitment and the need to do something. But as a result, there wasn't really adequate capital to invest in expert management or leadership, or really even the necessary built infrastructure to operate the kind of enterprise that they envisioned, which was a wholesale aggregator distributor of local product. They brought in a series of, as you saw, committed, passionate, and energetic managers to lead the enterprise, but none of them and none of the farmer owners, and then later none of the Series A investors, had specific expertise or background in wholesale produce or wholesale specialty foods. So the complicated logistics and management necessary for that sort of enterprise, we really had to, as I say here, learn by doing. And again, that lack of adequate capital also led to a sort of sink or swim, year-to-year mentality where there was never enough reserve capital to allow Grasshoppers to work out the kinks like any startup has to do. This isn't unique to food hubs. They were under constant pressure to make the cash flow work, which in a lot of ways informed the multiple changes in the business model that you saw. And as we said, the logistics, the quality control, and the infrastructure required for this enterprise were vast. They were working with 70 farmers, and when they switched to the CSA-style model, were upwards of 1,400 individual customers who were picking up boxes, which all had to be assembled by staff from, at times, up to 34 different drop locations. So this is not a simple enterprise to try to manage the inventory, manage the payments, and excuse me. Excuse me. Okay, so, and also the infrastructure was not limited to, the infrastructure limitations weren't just with Grasshoppers, it was also on the on-farm end, which we'll mention earlier, but there was no comprehensive cold chain from on-farm to Grasshoppers, which led to some quality control issues. Which is to say that the leadership and the management of Grasshoppers had to simultaneously learn the ropes of wholesale produce aggregation and distribution, while at the same time working to develop and implement innovative solutions to that business model of wholesale produce aggregation in order to serve the mission. So they were trying to rewrite the script that they didn't necessarily know yet. And this challenge was compounded by, as I said earlier, the need for overhauls of the business model due to cash flow shortages. And additionally, they struggled to really focus on which enterprises were most important for them to focus on, and part of that was the struggle, as many food hubs have, to find a workable solution to the logistic challenge of getting product from the farms in far-flung rural counties to the hub in a cost-effective way. So at different moments, early in the enterprise, they were renting a truck, driving out to farms, trying to make a transportation route work and make it cost-effective to bring the product from the farms, and then eventually abandon that and require that farmers deliver to them, which is, again, just to illustrate how many of the tricky practicalities that they were trying to work out in doing it. There we go. And some of the lasting impacts of this, that over time and through that learning, there were vast and great improvements in the logistics and quality control, both on-farm and off, through at Grasshoppers. So the development and instruction in standardized packing and box sizes and lot sizes. And also, we've learned from this, and we've seen in new initiatives happening in Kentucky, a focus on front-end fundraising for new initiatives. Recognize that investing in that expertise allows whatever the food hub-like initiative to really get off on the right foot, to know that they at least have the foundation of the logistics in place, and then to work on the innovations from there. Okay, another lesson learned, and similar to the last one, many of these kind of inform and affect each other, is that clear plans and metrics can help guide development decisions. As I mentioned with the trucking business, Grasshoppers was trying to, in many ways, be everything for the food system because they were really on the vanguard and there wasn't hardly anyone out there doing that sort of work. So they were operating a warehouse, a trucking business, a CSA program, attempts at value adding. So there were a lot of different business lines that could have been their own business in and of themselves. And I think in ways that lack of focus diluted efforts and contributed to that lack of expertise because they weren't able to focus and really hone in on one of the enterprise lines to make it work. And though they developed over time, early on there weren't clear metrics as to what success looked like in the different business lines beyond the cash flow. So clear benchmarks for what would be a successful or profitable drop point for the CSA weren't implemented until year 4 or 5. And starting without an accurate assessment of the state of supply and the nature of demand. So were they able to serve restaurant customers? What was wholesale distribution going to look like? And were their suppliers able to supply that? Not only could they grow it, but could they get it into a cold chain? Did they know how to grade, pack, and do the post-harvest handling? That was kind of a rude awakening for the business model and could have been prevented by more front-end research. And part of that is captured in this quote. Institutional sales, and this is from a former employee, institutional sales motivated us to find larger growers. It was difficult. We had a hard time finding producers that were experienced at growing the volumes that we needed for certain crops, which again is that supply side bottleneck. And through these efforts, some of the lasting impact that we saw were that there were partnerships that developed with private enterprises and expanded the capacity for local value-adding businesses. So the efforts around creating soups and creating IQF frozen products tied Grasshoppers into the broader network of value-added food businesses in the region, which I think speaks to the National Good Food Network and many people's interest in this idea of value chain facilitation, which was in last month's webinar. And there's now a strategic effort by statewide collaboratives to look at that idea of value chain facilitation. What businesses and what enterprises are really needed to build this food system rather than having a one-stop shop, do everything for everyone, realizing that we really need to focus and specialize and build on the expertise that we have available. And on that, having a good assessment, there are new efforts in the state and with the support of the University of Kentucky that are looking at ways to approach accurate and timely supply and demand analysis. There we go. Okay. So and then, oh, gosh. Come on. Sorry. There we go. Another lesson learned that to focus on the core competence and the value proposition of the food hub and let the business's success or the food hub success be the help. And what we mean by this is the mission of Grasshoppers, when generally articulated by employees, producers, was understood as helping small farmers. And while we all probably have a sense of what helping small farmers might look like from our perspective and would grab onto that idea in the abstract, in practice it's kind of tricky and certainly complicated to figure out how that plays out in the day-to-day logistics of a food hub. Does that mean paying the highest price to farmers? Does that mean affecting the largest number of farmers? Does that mean having a really large impact on a small number of farmers? Does it mean trainings and educational experiences? It can look like a lot of things, which can lead to mission creep, which is, kind of a siren song that we all hear. And one of the ways that affected Grasshoppers was the desire to, and Tim can speak more to this, but because of the nature of the funding, there was a sense of obligation to work with as many Kentucky producers from surrounding counties as possible, rather than identifying and working with core growers who could really meet the needs of Grasshoppers business. And, I mean, really, who would blame anyone for taking that approach? But because of that, and because there was a lack of capacity and really knowledge on the producer end, early on quality control and product standards were fairly lax and unspecified, with the idea that growers needed an opportunity to get their product to market, and they needed to be needed opportunity to learn and grow. But the impact of that was that, in some sense, producers were enabled in being lax in their quality control, and it prevented Grasshoppers from developing high-end restaurant or wholesale accounts who really demand that high-quality standards, and in some ways force Grasshoppers into the direct marketing approach. And another example is in pricing. So it was articulated that getting the best price to the farmer was really the greatest tool that Grasshoppers leadership saw in having their impact on the farmers. Prices were set once a year and sort of benchmarked against farmers market prices, with some additional benchmarking against high-end specialty wholesale. But there was a recognition, even among producers, and articulated strongly among producers, that Grasshoppers prices were awfully high, and some criticism that those high prices, while wonderful for producers getting started and small producers just transitioning from the high margins of direct marketing sales to farmers markets into a wholesale arena, it ultimately didn't serve the mission of being competitive in a wholesale market. And there was a sense of needing to avoid competition with local farmers in the development of the business model, which is to say that when, for example, when the CSA-style subscription service was in operation, Grasshoppers was targeting customers outside of what they would call the hardcore CSA customer base. So not wanting to take away from the market share of CSA subscribers that existing producers had, Grasshoppers chose to target people who hadn't had CSAs before. And through this, did a tremendous amount of market development and really introduced a lot of their customers to the practices of local food procurement. They also set themselves a sort of difficult row to hoe by choosing a model that's dependent on committed customers with an ideological drive to people who are more accustomed to a harder customer base to hit. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah. But ultimately, what was the biggest impact and the greatest advantage of Grasshoppers for the producers that served them, and what I mean when I say let the business be the help, is that being a reliable go-to market for local products at scalable volumes of production, that was the help. As this former supplier says, the farmer's market can be a real gamble, and it's really nice to have an upfront contract relationship with somebody that you feel is dependable. And while this producer is speaking more broadly, there weren't formal contracts. There were sort of general agreements and production planning that happened on the part of Grasshoppers, so that producers knew that if they grew, 4,000 row feet of tomatoes, that Grasshoppers was going to take all they could grow of it. And that really allowed producers to have some security in what they were doing, rather than wondering if they were going to go to the farmer's market and wait 8 hours and only sell 3 tomatoes. So in that sense, being a successful wholesale distributor of local product and a go-to buyer for wholesale volumes of that product with a reasonable price premium, given that it's wholesale, that was the most help and the greatest opportunity that Grasshoppers afforded. So being a successful food hub in the time that they operated was the greatest help. And finally, food hubs need support from other organizations to help develop producers, to develop consumer demand, and look at infrastructure needs. so much of Grasshoppers' efforts around producer development, offering trainings in GAP certification, wholesale production, production planning, and as well as the many workshops that they did for consumers around cheese tastings and cooking lessons and the newsletters, were critical in developing the demand for local and regional food and broadening education, but ultimately took away efforts or used up staff time that could have been devoted to bettering the enterprise. But the service provider community in Kentucky didn't show up in a way that we needed to have. So Grasshoppers was having to build the foundation of the food system upon which their business was based. And there was also a lack of distribution and processing infrastructure. Again, as I talked about the cold chain management. Excuse me. And on the producer end, and just this is sort of a side note but very related, we need to think, I think, as a regional food system community to recognize that it's not so simple to just switch from farmers market or CSA or direct marketing oriented production into a wholesale enterprise. There's a lot of differences that happen management-wise, production planning, infrastructure on the farm that take time and expertise on the part of the farmers. It's a different sort of enterprise. And the same goes for larger scale, perhaps transitioning from commodity growers who are looking to get into regional food markets. It's a very different mindset and requires different tools and expertise, both materially and in production. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the producer end. That was falling to Grasshoppers. There wasn't enough assistance coming to them. So the Food Hub itself needs to have the support of local nonprofits, of the Department of Agriculture, of the Land Grant Institution. I mean, speaking, pot kettle black, I'm here representing the University of Kentucky, that we really need to step up as a community to support the efforts of Food Hubs so that we can speak to the previous goal, which is letting a successful Food Hub be the help that the Food Hub is providing. Okay. Oh, just a shout out to Ben and Bree Abel there in the picture. They are two farmers, a farming couple that got their start selling his very first wholesale lot of butternut squash to Grasshoppers before they ever had a farm. And he recently, or they both recently got established in their farm, root-bound farm outside of Louisville, and are doing wonderfully, and really credit Grasshoppers with getting him into the wholesale production and becoming a successful young farmer. And they're great friends and great people, so look them up if you're in Louisville. So the lasting impact of this sort of lesson is that the Kentucky producers who were involved in Grasshoppers and those coming after them are now ready to enter the wholesale market. When Grasshoppers closed its doors, there was a lot of question of what's going to happen now, who am I going to sell to? But because new standards and quality control were put in place and the producers were held accountable to them in the final years of Grasshoppers, many of those producers were now ready to step into the traditional wholesale market and find success. So there's still a great need for these sorts of outlets. And consumers we talked to spoke to a greatly expanded understanding of the regional food system, of being exposed to new products, and the idea of seasonal eating. And one story in particular around changes in wholesale procurement came with changes in the Jefferson County Public Schools procurement program that changed from a 2-week bid window to a 6-month bid window, so that if local producers want to sell into the Jefferson County local food system, now they can know that they have the bid and have adequate time to plan for production, whereas the previous bid system was geared towards a standard wholesaler who was buying product in from wherever. And this is a quote from them, from a Jefferson County representative. I think Grasshoppers lacked experience in what we have to do. We would try to teach them. It was a learning experience for us as well. It's like two people trying to learn and teach each other at the same time while trying to make a profit. So that there was a real sense of partnership and collaboration and people coming to the table wanting to make this work. And I think moving forward, being intentional and really committing to and expanding those sorts of partnerships will be key. So in sort of summary of this section, the complexity of starting up and operating a wholesale and or retail local food enterprise really shouldn't be overstated. There's a lot of front-end planning and consideration and really fundraising that need to happen to set the food hub up for success. And food hubs can't be a cure-all for the regional food system. It takes a whole community of policymakers and service providers and funders to revitalize and rebuild missing pieces of our food system. And as part of that, both the hard or built infrastructure, cold chain, trucks, warehouses, and the soft or knowledge infrastructure, meaning expertise in wholesale production and planning, but also wholesale aggregation and distribution, are key. And clearly defined goals and metrics can help keep the food hub on track. Knowing what business you're in, what the value proposition is to both the suppliers and the customers, and keeping that at the forefront of the food hub's management can help prevent mission creep and keep things on track. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
All right, so I just want to take a couple of minutes to go through some accounting information, and this is a super dangerous thing to take on here for everybody. Waded already into the deep part of a webinar to suddenly introduce an economist to talk about accounting. But bear with us here. There are some really interesting things and lots of really useful information that I think can apply to a lot of folks looking at food hubs across the board. I wanted to just particularly note my appreciation for the Good Foods Network efforts to do this benchmarking work, things that Jeff and some of these other folks that have been involved with that benchmarking there is really, really valuable work, and I'm certain the Grasshoppers folks would have benefited from having some good conversation and opportunity to compare notes on some things. But what I wanted to I'll just go through a couple of slides here to give you a little flavor of it. I'll encourage for you folks that are interested in the financial data more to want to look under the hood there to actually go and look at our report, and you can see how we've tried to summarize and evaluate some of that financial data. For any kind of a business enterprise, of course, you're needing to look at these sort of basic elements of liquidity, solvency, efficiency, and profitability, information that can be extracted out of various elements of the income statements and balance sheets. And for the purposes of what we're just going to look at here briefly, we're going to look at the Grasshoppers financials, but also where we can compare with some of the Good Food Network Food Hub financials. But also another interesting thing to just kind of keep in mind is that there are many, many other small-scale food wholesalers, and particularly produce wholesalers, and there's some really good data that's available that we were able to get that looked at small produce wholesalers, the SageWorks industry data that we brought in there to also look at some of this financial information. So the first thing I want to look at here just a little bit is the issue of liquidity, and this is just looking at the current ratio, looking at the assets to liabilities ratio there, and you can see kind of a little bit of a volatility, particularly in the early years. The liquidity for Grasshoppers really struggling to have the short-term assets to meet their short-term obligations. This is not uncommon for a startup enterprise at all, and many food hubs experience this same sort of thing. Obviously, you like to see the current ratio improve and stay up certainly over the $1.50 to $2 to each dollar of short-term liabilities is ideal. One of the things that does muddy the waters here, and I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, is that this financial data is actually confounded a little bit by the infusion of grants, forgivable loans, other non-operating activity that can also make the evaluation of liquidity something especially important for food hubs to be able to pay attention to. The other factor, and this certainly was a challenge for Grasshoppers dependent significantly on produce, was the issue of seasonality. And while it's not crystal clear here in terms of being able to see the quarter by quarter variation as you might expect, they ran into a lot of those kinds of seasonality issues in terms of dealing with their liquidity. The other thing that is kind of an important story, and I might even go so far as to say one of the most important things to point to in terms of the challenges that Grasshoppers faced to become a viable going concern, was the challenge of debt. You can see here the debt to asset ratio, and what this is essentially doing is looking at the balance sheet and evaluating the debt load that's being carried for each dollar of assets. And you can compare that to the benchmarks. Obviously, you ideally want, debt is okay, but there's such a thing as too much debt. And if you can look here at how often this debt to asset ratio, you had more than a dollar's debt for each dollar of assets. That is a serious problem. And then the question is always, who owns the assets? Is it outside lenders, or is it the entity itself? And when the debt to asset ratio is over 1, that means that even if you liquidated all the assets there, there's not enough there to cover the liability that the company is holding. And taking on new loans, yes, there were some grants, and yes, there were some opportunities to pay down some of those loans, as you can see in some of these middle periods here, where things improved some. But in general, Grasshoppers really struggled to try to keep on top of debt. Of course, the big challenge with debt, of course, is the more debt that you're carrying, the more limitations that you have in terms of being able to embark on new strategies, pursue new growth initiatives, and probably most importantly, limited opportunity to go after new markets and secure additional debt if that's going to be an option there. So capitalization gets complicated when you have a high debt to asset ratio. I just want to show a couple of quick slides that look at asset efficiency. Asset efficiency is especially interesting as you look over the life of a firm, and what you like to see is that in this case here, sales to assets, sales to fixed assets, you like to see some evidence that learning economies, learning efficiencies, working management expertise that is working out inefficiencies in the system allow an entity to be able to generate higher sales to total assets or higher sales to fixed assets in this case. And so you like to see a graphic like this showing some increases over time. You might recall from our earlier graphic that we showed there about just the change in the number of general managers, particularly in the earlier periods there. There was a lot of turnover in employees, in management, in addition to a lot of the new capitalization challenges. And this made, I think, for a very difficult challenge for a food hub like Grasshoppers to really integrate some of the learning efficiencies that you would really like to see in a business that really has a clear focus on what it's doing, building on its assets, utilizing its assets efficiently. And another Similar efficiency ratio to look at is sales to labor, and so this is how much sales are we generating for each dollar of labor that's generated here. Again, you like to see experience and management be applied to the sales activity, the experience in developing new markets, relationships in different markets where the cost to generate future sales per dollar of labor is going down, and you'd like to see a graphic like this where it's actually increasing over time. And particularly if you note here this challenge from maybe 2009 or so down to 2012, leveling off here a little bit, but part of this challenge, I think, coming about from changing market focus, changing managers, some labor turnover is indicative, I think, of some of the challenges that you're going to see when you have a high turnover of both management and labor. This data here just looks at the sales per employee, and to kind of give a sense of that, from the National Good Foods Network benchmark, the sales per FTE employee on average is about 286,000, and you can see that it certainly grew over time, which is a good sign ultimately, but never really quite got up to even the average level of the benchmarks that we saw in some of those other food hubs, and certainly was very low early on in its season. That said, if you look over here at the profitability issue, it's actually quite striking. When Grasshoppers first started out, relatively small, relatively focused, primarily farmer-driven, not very much capital, as kind of a lean operation, actually seeing a positive net income. The thing that we have to offer a little qualification there is that it's probably more realistic to look at this earnings before income and taxes value here in terms of meaningful income. These are earnings before you factor in things like grants. So the early contribution of something like the USDA Value-Added Producer Grant is part of this positive net income, which is good, it's real, and certainly a grant program like the Value-Added Producer Grant, that's part of its goal and objective, is to try to provide some assistance for these operations that are trying to work out their markets, find their footing out there in the marketplace. But really, the first 3 years or so, you can see here really some struggle for Grasshoppers. Interestingly, when you get up here to 2010, 2011, these are actually very close to some of the benchmark levels that we saw with some of the other food hubs that were surveyed by the National Good Foods Network. But things slipping here again, and the challenge, of course, with when you're struggling to make a profit, and this just show this last financial graphic here. When you're struggling to make a profit and you're struggling to move into new markets, and some of those new market channels that you're pursuing actually have smaller margins than some of those low-hanging fruit, higher margin markets, it's really tough to cover expenses. And so you have to, obviously, for any kind of a business, you have to ask the question, why is profit important? Well, obviously, you have to have profit to be able to at least cover your expenses, so at least move toward a break-even enterprise. And we were talking earlier, and it's certainly absolutely valid that some of these triple bottom line type enterprises, you want to be able to factor in all of the different outcome elements that are there. But for an entity to really be a viable going concern, it really has to be able to, at some point in time, at least meet some minimum expectations with respect to profitability. Part of that profitability, ultimately, you would like to be able to see it there so that you could reinvest your earnings, to reduce some of your debt, to decrease some of your dependence on grant or outside funding, and obviously ultimately move toward having a more sustainable business. And something that Grasshoppers struggled with there, certainly toward the end. Really would recommend, if you're interested in the financial data, to pull up our report and go through some of that. And again, just one more time, really appreciating these benchmarking studies that allow us to try to gauge some of the important measures and ratios and financial health of some of these food hub entities, to hopefully make some remedial action there while there's still some opportunity to do that. So the last thing, we just want to just bring it in for last couple of minutes, just the last couple of slides here. Lily, and you can weigh in on these as we're just closing this part out. But certainly planning is really important. Having really clear expertise certainly can be really, really helpful. You know, when you're moving into the food marketing, food wholesaling, food distribution business, to have people that are going to be part of that business that have specific experience in that kind of business activity can really bring in a lot and help. It's very tough to be learning on the go as you're doing this sort of activity. Having a robust and balanced board of directors and having people that are able to provide solid input certainly is going to be helpful there as well. Lily, anything you want to tie up here on these the financial plans and metrics?
Nope, I think you've done a great job covering it. Are there any specific metrics? I mean, we talked about price per drop. Are there any that we should point out as having been key?
Yeah, price per drop, you know, keeping an eye on the margin that is associated with different market channels, trying to understand how market channels might have some complementary assets, you know, that sort of thing I think can be really helpful.
One thing that we touch on in the report that we haven't said here is, I mean, we've talked about margins and different direct marketing outlets having higher margins, but it's important to remember, and I always remind myself, margins are not profit. Margins are based on projected sales. You have to hit the volume of sales for that margin to meet your needs. So just to think critically about that. And I went into this at length earlier, so just to touch back on it, the thinking of the food hub success as the help, as meeting the mission. And when conceiving of a new food hub, really looking at the situation in your region, in the market and the environment that you're entering into, and identifying a strategic and parsimonious set of core services. So do only what you must and do it really well that address the highest needs within that context. So that might be a value-added processor, that might be a trucking business, but to do one thing well in your business. And in doing that one business line well, there's still going to be a lot of extra work and logistics to work out. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And as we said, that the food hub, we should consider a food hub as integrated into a broader network of service provision. That producers need some education and training and to transition into wholesale production and to meet these market needs. And for those food hubs that are operating in a context where having that broad network of support isn't available or isn't supportive, when you do engage in kind of extra enterprise activities like producer training, those we would suggest considering those as its own business line, and to document the time and the amount of, you know, in-kind or the cost of providing those services, and to account for how you will support that either through profits and sales or through grant support, but to not kind of discount it and not track that. Then you get into the problem where it might be running away with your assets and kind of diluting the efforts of making the food hub successful. Okay. And with that, thank you all so much, and we will pass the mic back to Jeff.
Thank you. I want to quickly introduce Malini for a sort of alternate perspective, complementary but alternate. And I hope that you can all cancel a little bit of your next meeting. I would like to have some time for questions and answers. So we are gonna, looks like we are gonna run a little long here. So fair warning. Malini is former Managing Director of Investments at Wholesome Wave, where she spent 3 years leading an impact investments team focused on food and agriculture, specifically structuring financing for food hubs. Her team orchestrated over $4 million in flexible investment into a variety of regional food enterprises and across an array of different investor types. Malini is a corporate expatriate who brings experience as a McKinsey consultant, JP Morgan banker, and AmeriCorps Vista. Malini has an MBA from University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and a BS in chemical engineering from Cooper Union. She also serves on the board of the Red Hills Small Farm Alliance. She is based in Chicago, and she's going to give us sort of a brief perspective as an investor in Grasshoppers and to share some select data from a post-Grasshoppers closing farmer survey. Malini?
Thanks, Jeff. I will try and go quickly so that we can get to Q&A as soon as possible. Thanks to the Wallace Center for having us on this webinar and to the UK team for their important research and analysis. The Wholesome Wave Healthy Food Commerce Investments team was an investor in Grasshoppers and was along for an important part of this journey from 2012 onwards. And so we wanted to share a couple of reflections and thoughts, certainly not all of what we've learned, but at least a little bit in today's webinar. Our team made a small, highly flexible loan in 2012 because we saw compelling potential for Grasshoppers to gain some operating efficiencies and extend its base of aggregation distribution activity into wholesale. And we came on at a time when Grasshoppers was proposing to work with schools, and you heard Lily talk about the Jefferson County Public Schools work. We invested just before that. And they were proposing to do work with the schools and partner with traditional distributors to manage local sourcing. We did end up restructuring the loan after Grasshoppers' sales faced some difficulty. Along the journey, we conversed very frequently with management and with the board, and we had a board observer seat. What this means is that we sat in on board meetings, but we had no voting power in making decisions. So we were a partner up close and personal through the many, the great value that was generated and the many difficult decisions and discussions that preceded the closing. From the experience that we've had with Grasshoppers and holding it in comparison to some of our other food hub investments and successful food hub investments, I wanted to offer 3 thoughts in a very forward-looking way for the various stakeholders in this sector, because our experience with Grasshoppers has sort of impacted and changed some of our thinking, and certainly applying those lessons and sharing them is important. The first would be how these different hubs are managing low season or off-season sales and sales surprises. I don't think any of these businesses can plan aggressively enough for off-peak seasons and sales surprises. And as you grow, it may not be, or as these businesses grow, it may not be enough to just rely on seasonal sales, and setting up multi-level backup plans for what to happen when sales underperforms is pretty critical. And this can be for a lot of different reasons. We saw situations in which a new salesperson came on in the peak season, made some bad calls that were executed during the peak season, and then sales tanked. And once that happens in peak season, you can't recover through the rest of the year. It can happen because a large supplier decides to stop producing, which we saw in New England and have heard cases of in Colorado as well. So that aggressive planning for what will happen when sales underperforms, particularly how to manage off seasons, is pretty important. Secondly, governance is hard. Building strong governance and communication between a management and a board is really difficult. And I don't think as a food hub community or sector we've had enough discussion about this and how difficult governance can be, even for a successful business. And this is a continuously, improving piece of work. There are always opportunities to improve how management and the board work together, communicate, review business information. Again, for any company, not just food hubs, but this is an important one to take into our future discussions. And the third is around tracking the data on farmer impact. We, as a triple bottom line investor, found it a little difficult at times to get some of the more socioeconomic impact data. I think tracking the details on farmer impact and having good data really helps a venture articulate their position for flexible funding, and that can be grants, it can be working with some of the new structures that are coming out of some impact investment groups, it can be CDFIs, but this is sometimes an afterthought because the hubs are so focused on operations. And so in terms of reflecting as an investor, I think this is another space where we can have a slightly stronger dialogue around what it takes for a business and a food hub business to actually do this. So our team took a triple bottom line approach to investment, which means we weren't solely focused on just the return of capital. We were also interested in supporting the socioeconomic and environmental value getting generated. And if we move to the next slide, we'll share a few highlights from a survey that we conducted after the closing of Grasshoppers, because we obviously lost cash, but at the same time turned around and said, you know, there has been some value generated here, and we had a couple of hypotheses going into this investment that we needed to go back and test and gather data to make sure we could test those hypotheses. So I'm going to start with our major takeaway, and it's one that I've been sharing with a lot of different food hub investors, which is, guess what, all food hub investments are not going to succeed, but all of them are going to contribute to building the sector. So similar to Silicon Valley, you know, 20 years ago, there's going to be a lot of investment in companies that are not going to survive, but all of those investments help together in aggregate build a sector. We surveyed farmers and talked with staff and really dug in to understand what kind of value was generated, and had a conclusion that was, I think, echoed in some of the UK research, that Grasshoppers may be closed, but in its wake there is a base of small farms that are equipped for working with markets they weren't equipped with working with before. So our hypotheses were centered around how food hubs were distinctly different from traditional distributors, that Grasshoppers and this investment would help Grasshoppers work with small farms and help those small farms in the area grow, that their services and the very particular kinds of services we see in food hubs that we do not see in traditional distributors, things like crop planning and training assistance and food safety training, those support services for producers will help them get larger if they want to get larger and go and work with traditional distributors if that's what they want. And then thirdly, that market access, the market access that Grasshoppers provides would reduce risk for farms. And from our data, a couple of things that we found, that farms did indeed add acreage that was attributable to Grasshoppers. I think what's interesting here is, you know, we got 96 acres. It's hard to tell if that's a huge number or a small number. Here we take it as a number, and in the future, I think maybe with other ventures, tracking this would be great to see. Almost half of this came from small farms. So what was notable about our survey was that when we separated out the respondents who were between 1 and 50 acres, there was a very specific, a very marked kind of appreciation for the services of Grasshoppers that was concentrated in the small farms. Secondly, over a third got training and assistance from Grasshoppers around some of the things you mentioned, crop planning and safety training. This is really important because commercial distributors don't do this. And if we're working towards, you know, thriving regional food systems where we have a diverse base of farms that can serve a lot of different markets, especially for the small farms that want to get bigger or do more institutional, that sometimes has to go through traditional distributors, this kind of support and training can be really pivotal. Over half agreed that Grasshoppers was a critical outlet. This is just validation that, you know, from the farmer survey that attested to the importance of the critical market channel. And lastly, this was more anecdotal. We were not able to sort of quantitatively validate the hypothesis around market access and risk, but over the course of collecting information, we came across a few really important anecdotes that by providing what we call liquidity in the market, right? Grasshoppers basically saying to a farmer, we'll buy it, we'll take it. That allows the farmer to take some risks. And two really strong examples that we go to all the time are one in which a farmer, through the trainings and work with Grasshoppers over many, many months, took steps to reduce and eliminate synthetic fertilizers. That kind of data at a large level is hard to capture, but when you get these anecdotes, you get really strong stamped out examples of the impact being created. And a second anecdote, the farm operations manager, a staff member, told us about a farm that had never grown with hoop houses before and was nervous and wanted to do it for the first time. Grasshopper said, we'll take it, we'll take your product. And that farmer not only got to extend the season, but had cash flow longer than he expected and had an outlet to provide that. So that reducing risk on the part of the farm is a pretty big value and important role that we see food hubs playing, and that we certainly saw coming out of Grasshoppers. Ultimately, this was a really valuable experience. This closure leaves lessons not just for the food hubs, but also for food hub investors and many of the supporting stakeholders in the food hub sector. And I look forward to any questions. But thank you very much to Jeff, the Wallace Center and the team, and to the UK team for putting this together.
And thank you, Melanie. All right, please keep those questions coming in. I'm going to start with a question about the margins. Seb asks, let me find it in the list here. Was the operations model a brokering or purchase and resale on margins or commission? And if you have access to data about what that margin or commission was.
Yeah, this is Tim. It was largely a purchase and resale model. The margin question was something that really evolved over time, and I think the later general managers really started to figure out that they were going to have to be much more intentional about setting margins, and some of that discussion is included in a little bit more detail in our report. But I think one of the things that we didn't really weigh in on, but I think is something that is really symptomatic here, is that producers were probably paid more than what they would have normally been paid selling to another wholesaler, and the margins were probably smaller. They were obviously smaller than what were needed to cover the operating costs of Grasshoppers, and so I think that was something that they really struggled with, trying to settle on that and try to kind of go market channel by market channel, is really what we know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you addressed part of this question, but what was the gross and net receipt value of the average purchase per farmer participant over the course of history? Did it grow as the scope of the business lines increased? I know Melanie talked about additional acres being put into production, which leads one to think that larger purchases were being made. But do you have any data about per farm increases?
Boy, we really don't. Although that's not impossible to go back and unpack. Lily made a really good point. Hopefully people picked up on this, but there was this kind of a missional intention to expand the number of producers that were involved, and so it just happened that as time went on, we saw more and more very small scale new producers that were coming in, which probably dampened what you would have seen overall as the average return per producer. But it would actually be very interesting. I think we would be able to do that, go back in and look at by producer what sales activity looked like over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, definitely very interesting. There was one of the themes was that Grasshoppers had to provide services that were not immediate market services. So Garnet asks, what work can nonprofits assist food hubs with that are explicitly not in the purview of Extension Services or Department of Agriculture? What kind of support did Grasshopper not receive from those type of organizations that could be filled by a third independent party? That sort of gets to there's two pieces of that question. One is, there can be a bit of a crowded space for farmer support, for market support. So where do nonprofits fit into that schema?
This is Lily. I'll touch briefly on this, and I'm sure Melanie and Tim have contributions to make as well. I think for what services can be provided, there was a great training offered by Grasshoppers. It was something like Growing for Wholesale Success. There was a partnership between the City of Louisville's Farm-to-Table Coordinator and Kentucky State University, which is our 1890s land-grant university in Kentucky, that provided that specific producer training. Now that, I think, was a great partnership between, and that could have easily been partnered with a nonprofit organization to bring support and coordination by the part of a nonprofit in the curriculum development with some of the expertise of a land grant. So I don't think that these things have to be mutually exclusive. And again, the more collaboration and partnership that happens, the better. So a lot of that producer training is around getting the producers ready to do that. I think there's interesting moves, and maybe this can be a later webinar, or actually there might have been one already, on the need for GAP training and GAP certification and different food safety issues for producers, getting them ready, that we're going to need to continue to have a lot of support and training around. And then on a general level, I think there's a lot of room for consumer education and local foods education. Part of my preliminary findings from the dissertation research is that having a nonprofit in place that's focused specifically on that consumer education part takes a lot of pressure off of a food hub entering into that market, because the kind of consumer base is primed. So there's a ton of work that can be done around that. Other ideas?
This is Melanie. I'll just add to that. I think meeting specifications. So food safety training is certainly one big piece of it. And then after that, it would be understanding how to meet customer specifications. This is particularly around institutional wholesale. I mean, I know the team worked so hard in what they were doing with Jefferson County, and you saw that reflected in the quote that was there. That kind of work is sometimes just in the market. It's difficult for a party outside of the transaction to do necessarily, but there may be a way to support it. But sometimes that just jockeying back and forth to help a producer get right, here's the format in which the product has to get to the customer. That we have seen takes up an extraordinary amount of time for hubs and producers that are doing it for the first time.
And I just echo again the value of the financial benchmarking. Melanie made a reference to it earlier, the need for board training, understanding of governance and leadership and kind of business management tools that are kind of unique to food hubs. Food hubs are kind of, well, they are obviously very unique kinds of business models that are scattered all over the place and don't lend themselves very easily sometimes to a local land-grant institution sort of standard off-the-shelf model.
And I'm going to do a little shameless self-promotion here. Lily made reference to this as well. Last month's webinar was on value chain facilitation, and there were several different pieces of the puzzle that these value chain facilitators do contribute to. So I encourage you all to go to ngfn.org/webinars and watch the recording from last month's webinar. I think there are some interesting insights into what support organizations can do. Okay, another question from the audience. This is sort of an opinion question, and I think I'm going to serve it to each of you, and we'll use this as our last question, because we are pushing up, but we're already over time. So Richard asks, what was the greatest issue? We talked about there were many struggles. Was it starting too big? Was it growing too quickly? Was it trying to do too much for too many? So Lily, you want to start, and then pass to Malini and Tim? This is an opinion. This is just your sense.
Yeah, I'm going to talk, so I stall while I'm trying to think of the answer. I think the greatest challenge, there's part of me that thinks that the eagerness and the passion to get up and running just with whatever money they had on hand and to just get something going and they'd figure it out from there. I don't want to, I mean, was that the greatest challenge? I don't know, but I keep coming back to that, where sometimes we're in such a hurry that something's got to be done right now. There's opportunity, and what are we waiting for? And I think that this is a good cautionary tale for taking the time to really look at all the pieces that need to be in place, to get the expertise you need, to really know what you're getting into before you leap. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
It's an excellent point, and with the luxury of several years, if people are starting, if people are starting now, there have been several studies and support, and so much learned that there's a stronger base to start from. At least I hope so.
Right, and not to keep talking too much, but I don't think we can emphasize enough that Grasshoppers was cutting new trail here. There weren't benchmarking studies. There weren't reports to look at. They were truly like learning as they were doing, and we can't give enough credit to the leadership of Grasshoppers, the 4 farmers who put their literally blood, sweat, and tears into that, and the later investors. So just to really, if we don't say anything else at the end, we have to touch.
Excellent point. Tim, you want to weigh in on what you think the biggest?
I would say the biggest issue, there's a variety, so we've touched on here, but I would say the biggest sort of leverage point, looking back on it, I think the thing that could have made the greatest amount of difference that we heard from pretty much across the board was being able to find leadership or management that had experience in the food business that could step up and immediately lay out, here are the expectations that we need in terms of margins, in terms of employee training, in terms of markets and market development, and to have had experience that would help the entity be able to craft a strategy and vision for moving forward, knowing already what was likely to work and what was not likely to work. Obviously, that helps in any kind of an organization there at all, but I think especially with an entity like this would really contribute to that.
Another excellent point, Tim, and I want to point out that the University of Vermont does have a food hub management certificate program. It's in its first year now. It's currently being offered, but will be offered in following years. So again, sort of continuing to build that base of support and experience. Malini, you want to weigh in on the biggie?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick too, and I'll focus on an external structural one, which is, you heard the UK team go over all the debt that Grasshoppers had, and hands down, Grasshoppers took on too much debt, and and concentrated with one type of investor. I'm going to say that the biggest challenge here was that food hubs, many food hubs in this particular type of work or rely or benefit from some sort of subsidy or very flexible capital. A lot of that capital, if it's coming from agencies or foundations or funds, is quite frankly not moving at the pace of business. Things are getting better in terms of that flow happening in a slightly more accommodative way. But for entrepreneurs out there and food hub operators out there who have tried to raise money, they know this. It's so hard to actually get capital when you need it. Not just get it, but get it when you need it and in the format that you need it. So I will say that it's a mismatch between the criteria and pacing of the investment capital that's out there and the needs and pacing of the businesses out there. And then I will say things are getting better. I'd like to see them get better faster.
Excellent. All right. Well, with that, thank you, audience, for sticking with us. Thank you, Lily, Tim, Malini. Special thanks to Malini, who is in the middle of traveling and really made time for this webinar. So thank you. Food hubs are now well understood to be vital to creating a true 21st century, more values-based food system. It's a food system that consumers want, and we're seeing that entrepreneurs across the country are innovating to serve this demand. And so it's just so exciting to see us learning from success, learning from challenge. This webinar is being recorded. It will be archived on YouTube along with the over 50 other webinars we've done in the past. I have made reference to at least one other one. Feel free to send others who you think would like to have heard this presentation there, and take some professional development time yourself and dig through the archive. So you can go to YouTube and search for the Wallace Center, or you can go to ngfn.org/webinars. So this webinar should be up within a few business days. We offer the NGFN webinars on the third Thursday of each month at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, noon 30 Pacific. Sign-up links are at ngfn.org/webinars. And if you get on our mailing list, we will email them to you. Just a convenient link. Whereas today we looked deeply into one real food hub, Food Hub's operations and finances. In March, we're going to take a different approach. We'll look at different Food Hub models using realistic but strictly theoretical examples. We'll again dig deep into the finances and the operations of the models. And as models, we're able to see what happens as we change the way the business works. We'll look at some minor changes and some major changes. And really the goal is to give you a sense for the size that different types of hub models need to be in order to reach a break-even point, and perhaps even more importantly, to reach a point where the hubs are viable in the long term. So I think this pair of webinars is an interesting juxtaposition. There will be an option to automatically sign up for this webinar in the post-webinar survey, so please give us your feedback and let you know if you want us to sign you up. I did want to tell you that the Agricultural Marketing Service of USDA, who has for years maintained a farmers market directory, has now added an on-farm market directory, a CSA directory, and most applicable for this webinar, a food hub directory. So if you or people you know are involved with any of those activities, please visit USDA-localfooddirectories.com and enter their information. For each directory, there's a critical mass before they're searchable. So I've created a quick link, bit.ly/regmyhub, in order to go directly to the Food Hub registration area. You can find the National Good Food Network on YouTube, on Twitter, and our website is ngfn.org. The Wallace Center is also on Facebook. Come like us. You can search for Wallace Center at Winrock International. And again, if you haven't already, make sure you sign up for our email updates. There's a link on the ngfn.org homepage, or just let us know in the post-webinar survey and we will sure sign you up. Contact us at any time. Our email address is contact@ngfn.org. The NGFN would like to thank you for your time today, and once again, let me encourage you to fill out that survey that should open your web browser in just a moment. Thank you. This concludes the webinar.